Super Bowl being played on Sunday between the Chiefs and the Eagles. The Eagles are going to be the de facto home team. They're going to be wearing their colored uniforms, their green ones. The Chiefs are going to be wearing the white away. Why do I bring that up? Oh, I don't know. Only just the past 12 of the past 15 Super Bowl winners have all worn white. That is weirdly a lot for something that should be coincidental like that. But anyway, I wanted to take a look back in the history books to see the very first Super Bowl that these two teams ever played in. Now, they've never played each other in the big game. This is the first for the matchup. However, both of these teams have played in Super Bowls before and both have won them before. But we're not going to be talking about that today. The very first Super Bowl the Kansas City Chiefs ever played in was the very first one, Super Bowl I, which at the time was called the AFL-NFL World Championship game because they didn't have a proper name for it yet. It was the very first game they ever played it. The year was 1967, and the Chiefs were 11-2-1 going into that game. This was before they moved to a 16-game schedule, so it was still 14. Week 5, they lost 14-29 against the Buffalo Bills, who they would later go on to play in the AFC, or at the time AFL Championship game, and beat them 31-7. And then in Week 7, they lost to the Oakland Raiders 13-34. Their only other not win of the season was a tie in Week 12, and that came against the, at the time, Boston Patriots, which later became the New England Patriots. That game was tied, I think, 13-all or 16-all or something like that. Now, if you look at the final score of the first Super Bowl, it's not particularly close. 35-10, you would assume it would be a blowout the entire time. That's not entirely accurate. The first half was extremely close. The score at halftime was 14-10, and up to that point in the game, the Chiefs actually outgained the Packers 181 yards to just 164 yards. Also, fun fact about Super Bowl I, because the AFL and NFL were different leagues at the time, when they played each other, each league had their own ball. The Wilson ball it has always been the official NFL ball, and it's nicknamed the Duke. In the AFL, however, they used a Spalding ball that has like the college stripes off the side, like the painted stripes. So whenever the Chiefs were on offense, they would give them the AFL official ball, and whenever the Packers were on offense, they would give them the NFL official ball. And also the referees of the games were a mix between AFL referees and NFL referees. The game started slow. They traded punts to start the game before the Packers went on an 85-yard drive in just 6 plays to get a touchdown to Max McGee, which, for the record, only caught 4 passes the entire year prior to this game for only 91 yards. Kansas City's next drive, their kicker missed on a 40-yard field goal attempt after the Packers' touchdown, which kept the game at a 7-0 score. Early on in the second quarter, the Chiefs drove down the field to score a touchdown to tie the game at 7, before the Packers went back down the field and scored a short touchdown with Jim Taylor, their running back. Kansas City then started their next drive with a massive 8-yard sack, but bounced back as Len Dawson, the Kansas City Chiefs quarterback, went 4 for 4 on the drive for 58 yards to get them into field goal range before the first half ended. Which meant, at the end of the first half, the Chiefs had more first downs and more yards than the Packers did. However, the entire trajectory of the game was set to change early on in the third quarter. That 50-yard interception return that started from a ball that was thrown at the Chiefs' own 49-yard line would change the game forever. The rest of the game, the Chiefs did not score. 21 unanswered points from the Packers would propel them to the victory. Now, because it was the first time these two leagues had ever played against each other, there was a lot of animosity heading into the game, and a lot of feelings of we have to win, we have to prove ourselves that we're the better league, we're the better team for both sides. And after the win, Joe Lombardi was asked what he thought of the Kansas City Chiefs, and he said while they are a good team and a well-coached team, he thought that there were multiple NFL teams that were tougher to play than the Chiefs were, including the Dallas Cowboys, who they had beaten in the NFL Championship game just a week prior. The final stats on the game, the Packers ended up having 21 first downs to the Kansas City Chiefs 17. The Packers had 361 total yards where the Chiefs only had 239. And a big part of why the Chiefs lost was because of the era that they were playing in. They really needed to have a good ground game. And they just didn't. Overall rushing statistics for both teams, you can see the miles apart they were. The Kansas City Chiefs had just 72 rushing yards compared to the Packers 130. And Len Dawson, the starting quarterback for the Chiefs, had the most rushing yards on the team, not even the two running backs. Dawson's numbers on the game was 16 of 27 for 211 yards, 1 touchdown, and a pick. Their receivers, Chris Burford, had 4 receptions for 67 yards for 27-yard long. Meanwhile, their number 1 receiver throughout most of the season, Otis Taylor, had 4 receptions for 57 yards. You remember that Max McGee guy who only had 4 receptions the whole season prior to this? Yeah, well in the Super Bowl he had 7 receptions for 138 yards and 2 touchdowns. That's a lot. Bart Starr finished the game 16 of 23 for 250 yards, 2 touchdowns, and a pick, and they had more rushing yards. Len Dawson is, before Patrick Mahomes, the face of the Kansas City Chiefs for a very long time, and it's unfortunate that he lost the Super Bowl. However, he did get his revenge just a couple years later against the Minnesota Vikings. Now, flipping on over to the NFC participant in this year's Super Bowl, the Philadelphia Eagles. Fast forward from Super Bowl 1, about 14 years, and you get to Super Bowl 15, where the Philadelphia Eagles went 12-4 in the regular season under the 5th-year head coach Dick Vermeil, and ended up getting to the Super Bowl, which is the first time they had been in an NFL championship game since all the way in 1960. Interestingly, the 12-4 Philadelphia Eagles at one point in the season were 10-1 in Week 12 and took on the Oakland Raiders, who they would eventually meet in Super Bowl 15, and they won that game 10-7, which improved the Philadelphia Eagles to 11-1 and knocked the Oakland Raiders down to 8-4. Despite winning that game, the Oakland Raiders actually outgained Philadelphia in terms of yards, but they did have 1 more turnover than they did. It's also worth mentioning that the Oakland Raiders had a much tougher road to get to the Super Bowl than the Eagles did. The Raiders had to go through the Houston Oilers. They beat them 27-7 in the wild card round. Then they had to play the Cleveland Browns and won that game 14-12. That game was also known as being the Red Right 88 play that's famous for the interception that the Oakland Raiders had as the Browns were just about to score, which would have propelled them to their first championship game. And then they had to go to San Diego to play the Chargers, and they lost that, and they won that game 34-27, which also meant that the Oakland Raiders became the first wild card team in the NFL to make the Super Bowl, as no one had done it up to that point. This game did not start off great for Philadelphia. Ron Jaworski, the quarterback at the time, very first throw went like this.
The Eagles' offense was no match for the Raiders.
Jaworski would go on to throw 3 interceptions in this game. And honestly, that was probably the biggest difference in this game compared to the other one that they played earlier in the season. In that game, Philadelphia did not have a turnover. Oakland had 1. In this game, Oakland did not have a turnover. Meanwhile, the Philadelphia Eagles had 4, one of which was a fumble. That pick, by the way, earlier in the game, set up Jim Plunkett for a 2-yard touchdown pass to Cliff Branch, which, by the way, tied Max McGee and John Stallworth for the Super Bowl record at the time for 2 touchdown receptions. So even though they've never played each other, the Oakland Raiders did get the better of the Eagles, the same way the Packers got the better of the Chiefs, and both of the team's opponents had a receiver that scored 2 touchdowns. Midway through the first quarter, Ron Jaworski actually threw a 40-yard touchdown pass to Rodney Parker before it was called back because of an illegal motion on their number 1 receiver at the time, Carmichael. The Eagles would go on to not score a touchdown until late in the third quarter when the game was pretty much over anyway, so that was a huge turning point in the game. Unlike the other one, which was close in the first half, this one was actually more of a difference in the first half than the second half. The Oakland Raiders led 14-0 at the end of the first quarter, and they had a chance to go up 17-0 before their kicker missed a 45-yard field goal with just 4 minutes left in the first half. Philadelphia then marched down the field to the 11-yard line where they had a chance for a touchdown, but Ron Jaworski missed his open receiver in the end zone, and then they went to kick a field goal. On that field goal, however, the kick was blocked by the Raiders, which meant that going into halftime, the score was still just 14-3. The rest of the game was pretty much all the Oakland Raiders. The Philadelphia Eagles did score another field goal and then another touchdown. Not necessarily in that order, I don't remember which, but the game was pretty much over anyway. The stats on this one, the Oakland Raiders did outgain the Philadelphia Eagles 377 total yards to the Eagles just 360, but the Eagles had more first downs than the Raiders did. And again, in this era of the NFL, the rushing game was very important, which is another big reason why the Eagles just didn't quite stack up to the Raiders in this category. The game ended with the Eagles only having 69 rushing yards, while the Oakland Raiders had 117. Jaworski's final stats in the game was 18 of 38 for 291 yards, 1 touchdown, and 3 interceptions. Wilbert Montgomery ended up with 6 receptions on that game for 91 yards with a long of 25. Meanwhile, Carmichael, their normal #1 receiver, had only 5 receptions for 83 yards, but did have a longer long as a 29-yard reception. Jim Plunkett won MVP despite throwing less passes and less yards. He was 13 of 21 for 261 yards. However, he did have 3 touchdown passes. Cliff Branch finished with 5 receptions for 67 yards and 2 touchdowns, while Bob Chandler had 4 receptions for 77 yards. Neither is quite as impressive as Kenny King, who on only 2 receptions has 93 yards and an 80-yard touchdown reception. Unlike the Chiefs, which won Super Bowl IV just 3 years after their Super Bowl defeat, the Eagles would have to wait a very, very long time before they made their next Super Bowl, in which they ran into the almost unstoppable New England Patriots in the early 2000s and lost, which ultimately resulted in the Patriots being the only team to win back-to-back Super Bowls in recent memory. They would go on to get their revenge against the Patriots later on, however, in 2016 with Nick Foles as their quarterback. That might have been 2017. I think it was 2017. And that wraps up the Super Bowl history for these teams. I did skip over a couple of the Kansas City Chiefs Super Bowls because they're fairly recent. But yeah, overall they both lost their first Super Bowls but did eventually get one. The Chiefs got one a little bit sooner than the Eagles did, but the Eagles had their first Super Bowl win more recently than the Chiefs did up until 2019, where they beat the San Francisco 49ers. As for my thoughts on this game, I think it's pretty much just if the Eagles can run the ball effectively and contain Mahomes and that offense to around 24, 27 points, they have a pretty good chance of victory. But if it turns into a shootout, the Kansas City Chiefs are going to take it. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you enjoyed the new setup. And I'll see you all in the next episode. Goodbye!